Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the final lecture of the 2009-2010 Forum on Connections. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I'd like to point your attention to this wonderful concert that the Forum is offering on Thursday, April 22nd in the Trinity Center downtown. It's called When Music and Sweet Poetry Agree. It's in honor of Shakespeare's birthday, which is a noble cause. And it celebrates the close connection between music and verbal art in the Renaissance. So very much in keeping with our theme this year. And I hope you'll all be there. So now to tonight's program. This is a special occasion for me on a couple of grounds. First of all, it's the very last time that I'll be welcoming you to a program at the Penn Humanities Forum. After 11 years as founding director of the Forum, I'm going to return to civilian life as an English professor. The Forum will go along on its happy way. And I urge you to keep attending. The programs will be wonderful, and you'll hear more about that at some later date. The second reason why this is a special occasion for me is that I get to introduce my colleague, Peter Conn, the Vartan Gregorian professor of English at Penn. Peter has been my colleague since I came to Penn 30 years ago. And that means that he's been here even longer than 30 years. A fact that perhaps he wouldn't like me to mention. Indeed, when Peter asked me whether he could give his lecture without being introduced at all, just to get out here and start spouting away, maybe he was trying to avoid having this embarrassing fact mentioned. But more likely, he was just being modest. I could spend a lot of time reciting to you all the fine achievements of my colleague, Peter Conn. He's the winner of virtually all of Penn's major teaching awards. He's a past John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, the author of many highly regarded studies of American literature, including his biography of Pearl S. Buck, which was chosen as a New York Times notable book, nominated for National Book Critics Circle Award, honored with the Athenaeum Award, and on and on and on. Peter has lectured widely in universities and museums, and has taught as a visiting professor at the University of Nanjing in China. He's been a consultant on television series, including Oprah's Book Club, which is probably one of the most influential ways that anybody could ever interact with the literary world. The teaching company issued his box set of video lectures on the bestseller just last year. Peter has been an important citizen of the university, serving in the deputy provost's office under Judy Roden. His service to the Philadelphia public schools has been prodigious. His philanthropic efforts on behalf of the Pearl S. Buck Society and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation set a standard for generosity and social responsibility that few of us in the Academy can match. All of this, and he found time this year to be the topic director for the Penn Humanities Forum on Connections, too. So please join me in welcoming Peter Conn as he speaks to us tonight about bestsellers, communities of readers past and present.
Oh, thank you. We're going to change the program, and I'm just going to ask Wendy to keep going. This is, as she said, the final lecture in our spring series. And as she also mentioned, but I want to mention it again, it's the last lecture over which Wendy will preside as the founding director of the Penn Humanities Forum. And I would like you to join me in saluting her for 11 years of exceptional accomplishment. It, in my view, has been a very good year. Beginning last September, our speakers have illustrated the robust versatility of our theme connections in all sorts of domains. They have explored social networking, the galloping connectivity of global English, and pandemics as the most lethal form of human connectedness. Using early China as his case study, Victor Mayer illuminated the political and economic connections that defined Central Asia, and Lisa Owen reconnected verbal and visual thinking. This evening, I want to talk about the connections that have been forged by best-selling novels. Over the past 2 centuries, these books have not only catalyzed communities of readers, they have also on a number of occasions intervened in our larger national debates, transforming their readers into partners in social and political change. Until fairly recently, best-selling novels have been confined to the low-rent neighborhood of serious literary scholarship. Critics and readers have traditionally sorted novels into contrasting compartments. Books that engage deeper questions and repay close study and rereading on the one hand, versus books that provide the guilty pleasures of transient entertainment. It may be, as Lawrence Levine and others have argued, that the sharp divide between highbrow and lowbrow is a relatively recent invention. No matter. All of us, general readers and critics alike, have for generations vigilantly patrolled that border. Indeed, an odor of suspicion may attach to any book that sells too many copies. Suspicion tinctured with just a hint of envy. The list of best-selling novels and the list of canonical novels very seldom overlap. The familiar choice, squeezed into 2 words, has been defined as quality versus quantity. Though I spend a lot of time on the slummy side of the street, I accept the distinction. The imaginative works of such writers as Shakespeare and Milton, Henry James and Emily Dickinson recall us to our humanness, enacting our deepest moral and emotional experiences in languages that surpass our own paltry powers of expression. In short, the great books remain indispensable. But they are not the only books worth reading. We've come to understand that popular literature can teach us a great deal about the nation's history and its recurring debates, and about the astonishing cast of characters that have peopled this country from its earliest days. In short, popular literature offers at least a part of the answer to the perennial question of American identity. Critic William St. Clair has recently observed that literary history should take at least some account of, quote, books that were actually read, end quote. Teachers and scholars are now taking such account. Even a casual internet search will uncover graduate and undergraduate courses in a dozen universities dealing with bestsellers, and a half a dozen recent books have been published on the subject. A good place for us to start is probably with a definition. What is a bestseller? The phrase is not nearly as self-evident as it seems. To begin with, the term bestseller dates back only to the 1890s. In 1895, a magazine called The Bookman published a list of books in what it called the order of demand. The top-selling novel on that first list, by the way, was a Scottish romance by Ian McLaren with the wonderful title, Beside the Bonnie Briar Bush. I can't say that without dropping into that preposterous accent. Further complicating our consideration of bestsellers, a distinction must be made. As several scholars of popular literature have pointed out, the term bestseller is misleading. It is really a comparative masquerading as a superlative. Think about it. From that first tabulation of bestsellers in the 1890s to the present, best-selling books have appeared as lists, never as single titles. When we say that a book is a bestseller, we invariably mean that it appeared somewhere in a gathering of 10 or 15 or even more books. In short, the most honest definition of the coveted label bestseller is quite simply something like a book that has sold a lot of copies along with a lot of other books that have also sold a lot of copies. Given the range of bestsellers, from novels of suspense and horror to science fiction and bodice-ripping romances, they would seem to have little in common. However, a large percentage fall into categories, often described as genres, which are usually governed by quite recognizable rules and regulations. Which is to say, these books are specimens of formula fiction, written in conformity to well-established practice, and therefore offering quite predictable pleasures. Thus, they can serve as places of retreat from the daily messiness of life. In place of ambiguity and failure, we have access to glimpses of clarity and resolution. We find what we expect to find. The persistence of genre novels tells us something about the making of bestsellers and about the book trade more generally. Many books resemble comfort food, offering the security of familiar plots, character types, and even settings. Genre, to put it another way, is a species of marketing. And to put it yet another way, genres demonstrate one of the characteristics of many bestsellers. What sells today, and presumably tomorrow, is what sold yesterday. The new thing will undoubtedly come along, but its arrival is completely unpredictable. More typically, publishers amalgamate our individual past choices into statistical forecasts, and in a more or less virtuous circle, we get more of what we want. 2 examples. My own favorite genre is detective fiction, preferably of the country house, rather than the police procedural variety. The sort of novels that Edmund Wilson had in mind in the sneering title of his essay, "Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?" The answer Wilson offered to his own rhetorical question was nobody should care who killed him. As Wilson put it, quote, "How can you care who committed a murder which has never really been made to take place because the writer hasn't any ability of even the most ordinary kind to persuade you to see it or feel it? How can you probe the possibilities of guilt among the characters who all seem alike because they are simply names on a page?" End quote. For Wilson, reading mysteries was a bad habit, somewhere in between smoking and doing crossword puzzles. Sherlock Holmes and his descendants from the golden age of the 1920s and 30s to today have tended to produce versions of the same story. A body is found in the drawing room, in the garden, in the garage, and the police are helpless. The brilliant sleuth gathers the clues, sorts them out while discarding the red herrings, and announces the identity of the murderer in the final chapter. Amazement and applause all around. Stipulate that Edmund Wilson was right and that mystery stories are a vice. They have proven to be an extremely addictive bad habit. Scholars have estimated that as many as 1 out of every 10 novels published in the United States today can be categorized as a mystery of some sort. The millions of us who buy and read these books, even if we sometimes hide them behind the covers of Finnegan's Wake or Gravity's Rainbow, form a virtual community. Despite our many differences, we spend a portion of our lives inhabiting the same fictional worlds. When we happen to strike up a conversation with a reader of similar tastes, we form a fleeting but satisfying bond, rank ordering and comparing our various favorite writers. If mystery books have cornered 10% of the market, my second example of genre fiction can claim an even larger share. Welcome to the world of Harlequin romance. Take a look at these eye-popping numbers gathered by Tara Liss Marino. In 2008, the most recent years for which the numbers are available, romance novels outsold all other genres, occupied the largest sector of the publishing market, totaled over $1 billion in sales, and were read by 75 million people. In addition, romances have given new and literal meaning to the idea of formula fiction. Do any of you in this room want to become a successful and perhaps wealthy writer of novels in the fabulously profitable Silhouette Desire series? Here is all you have to do. Go to the Harlequin homepage and study these writing guidelines. Quote, at 55,000 words, Silhouette Desire books are filled to the brim with strong, intense storylines. These sensual love stories immediately involve the reader in the romantic conflict and the quest for happily ever after resolution. The desire hero should be powerful and wealthy, an alpha male with a sense of arrogance and entitlement. The Texan hero should own the ranch, not work on it. And the urban hero should be the company CEO, not a handyman. The desire heroine is a flawed and complex person. She is strong-willed and smart, though capable of making terrible mistakes when it comes to matters of the heart. This is primarily her story, so instead of dividing the novels equally, Desire books should be 60% heroine and 40% hero. If we are tempted to make fun of this sort of thing, ponder again the figure $1.3 billion and consider who might be getting the last laugh. The appetite for specialized kinds of romance has impelled a proliferation of subcategories, genres within the genre. Go to the website and you'll find that Harlequin's many imprints now include Harlequin medical romance, Harlequin spice, including hot reads and erotica. Now, if you'll take your eyes off that handsome man in the back for just a moment, I can tell you something about the two ladies. One is a world-famous physicist. The other is a werewolf. But you will have to read the book for yourself to find out which is which. There is Harlequin historical, Harlequin bites, which are indeed vampires, Harlequin intrigue, stories of romantic suspense, and my favorite, Harlequin NASCAR. Stories about the, quote, rush of the professional race car circuit and the thrill of falling in love, end quote. So, many bestsellers are more or less interchangeable units in the creation and maintenance of a virtual community of like-minded readers who, across time and place, share a commitment to a particular species of readerly pleasure. That commitment, as you know, can sometimes become inflamed. There seem to be quite a few people, presumably otherwise sane, who are convinced that Sherlock Holmes was not fictitious, but quite real, and that he is still alive. The British Postal Service has from time to time assigned special staff to handle the mail directed to 221B Baker Street. In thousands of instances, virtual communities have been supplemented by face-to-face gatherings. Women have always been the principal consumers of fiction in this country, and for many of them, and a lesser number of men, book groups have become gratifying social networks. And in at least one extraordinary episode, the book group went national. With 13 million viewers at its peak, Oprah's book club had the muscle to make a difference in book sales and to create almost instantaneous communities of readers. One scholar has estimated that in the first 3 years of the book club, Oprah books sold an average of 1.4 million each. Winfrey deserves a great deal of credit. At a time when the National Endowment for the Arts has warned that Americans are reading less, Oprah's book club has probably done more to kindle interest in books and reading than all the English professors in the United States put together. At this point, I want to shift the focus of my remarks and talk about a handful of bestsellers that have transcended their value as entertainment and have forged more profound connections with the nation's culture. I have chosen 3 novels to exemplify different versions of this hypothesis: Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle, and The Good Earth. In the 8 decades that separate the first of these titles from the last, the 1850s to the 1930s, these immensely popular books also played a more or less demonstrable role in the shaping of American ideas and values. And now we go to that. In 1862, Harriet Beecher Stowe visited President Abraham Lincoln at the White House. "So," Lincoln reportedly said by way of introduction, "you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The book, of course, was Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, which Stowe had published a decade earlier. It was the best-selling American novel of the 19th century and was probably the first American book to sell 1 million copies. Lincoln's remark, if he made it, was a friendly exaggeration, but it contained a kernel of truth. Stowe had intended to intervene directly in the debate over slavery, and she succeeded far beyond her expectations. Praised and attacked by newspapers, clergymen, and politicians all over the country, Uncle Tom's Cabin put a human face on the institution of slavery. When one of her sons, 18-month-old Samuel Charles, died in a cholera epidemic in 1849, Stowe wrote, "It was at his dying bed and at his grave that I learnt what a poor slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her." That emotional solidarity and her outrage at the fugitive slave law impelled Stowe to start writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Over the course of nearly a year, from the summer of 1851 through the spring of 1852, the novel appeared in serial installments in an abolitionist magazine. When it was published in book form, 10,000 copies were sold in the first week, 300,000 in the first year. Presses worked 24 hours a day, turning out copies to meet the demand. Uncle Tom's Cabin evoked a response that was unequaled before or since. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass said that the word of Mrs. Stowe is addressed to the soul of universal humanity. And Leo Tolstoy called Stowe's novel, quote, a great work flowing from the love of God and man. Southern reaction was predictably quite different. George Frederick Holmes called Stowe a foul-mouthed hag, while the South Carolina novelist William Gilmore Simms wrote, Mrs. Stowe betrays a malignity so remarkable that the petticoat lifts of itself, and we see the hoof of the beast under the table. Whatever the novel's limits as literature, it quickly assumed an almost unique place in the history of American fiction. Stowe's characters may have been drawn with the simplicity of allegory, but they became synonymous with their virtues and vices. Innocent Eva, sanctified Tom, and the cruel Simon Legree are among those rare fictional creations that have stepped out of their novel and become permanent residents in America's collective imagination. In its depictions of African American characters, and especially its title figure, Uncle Tom's Cabin has generated a long and sometimes heated debate. Nonetheless, generations of Americans learned much of what they thought they knew about slavery from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. The story and its characters turned up everywhere in the second half of the 19th century. In paintings, in lithographs, toys and playing cards, porcelain figures, in unauthorized sequels, in songs, and especially in the innumerable dramatizations that made up a significant part of the nation's theater from the 1850s through the First World War. Like Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle is less widely read today than it was 100 years ago. But the title has remained indelibly inscribed on the national memory. Upton Sinclair's novel renders life as a jungle, particularly for the poor, a ceaseless struggle for survival in which the strong prey on the weak. Sinclair was a self-proclaimed socialist revolutionary. His target was capitalism and its plutocratic masters. John D. Rockefeller, invoking a homespun version of social Darwinism, had notoriously commented that the growth of American business was like the growth of an American beauty rose. Small buds must be snipped to permit the largest blossom to flourish. The billionaire as botanist. For the immigrant workers in Sinclair's novel, trapped in the slaughterhouses of Chicago, one misfortune follows another. The stockyards are home to a grisly choreography of death. Animals slide down a chute on one end of a building. They are killed and impaled on a hook that carries their carcasses past a sequence of workers, an assembly line of butchery. One man cuts the large carcass in half. Those next in line slice off particular portions of the animal. By the end of the bloody journey, a matter of mere minutes, nothing is left. In a famous phrase, every part of the animal except its squeal has been harvested. That's an ad for the Armour Company, which was kind of proud of the squeal. And you may or may not be able to read from the back. Round goes the wheel to the music of the squeal. As he lingers over the brutality of the killing, Sinclair repeatedly pushes his descriptions toward metaphor. The men who work in these foul-smelling, filthy, cold, damp, dangerous factories are themselves not far removed from the animals they slaughter. This is the novel's central argument. Workers have little more control over their lives and deaths than the pigs and cattle on which they use their razor-sharp knives. The Jungle was an international sensation. Published in February 1906, the book appeared almost immediately in a British edition. Over a dozen translations quickly followed. Within a few months, Congress passed legislation creating the Food and Drug Administration, assigning the new agency strong authority for regulating the quality of the nation's food. It was a triumph. But Sinclair felt that he had been defeated. He often said he had aimed for the public's heart and had hit its stomach instead. President Theodore Roosevelt and the nation's citizens had reacted swiftly and decisively to protect themselves from tainted meat, but they had ignored the Jungle's political message completely. So while the novel illustrates one of the most decisive interventions that a bestseller has made in the nation's politics, the outcome was, at least in Sinclair's view, sadly ironic. Pearl Buck's second book, The Good Earth, was the first work of fiction to be named the best-selling American novel for 2 consecutive years, 1931 and 1932. The book won the Pulitzer and has since sold millions of copies in English and in more than 70 translations. In the fall of 2004, Buck's novel returned to the bestseller list when it was featured on Oprah's book club. The Good Earth received exceptionally strong notices in every leading newspaper and magazine in the country. Many of the reviews paid particular tribute to the authenticity with which the novel presented its Chinese subject matter. To be sure, since few, if any, of those early reviewers had any first-hand experience in China, they were hardly authorities on the facts of Chinese society. What they more precisely meant was that The Good Earth presented Asian characters who were not mere stereotypes and who behaved as recognizable and even ordinary people. The Good Earth was the first American novel set in Asia to become a bestseller. Up through the 1920s, Americans knew next to nothing about China or any other Asian country. Travel was difficult, language barriers were insurmountable, and incomprehension prevailed in both directions. Separated by a vast ocean from Asia, neither American politicians nor the public had much interest in acquiring knowledge of any Asian society. That insularity has diminished today, but it surely persists. Some of you may have seen the bumper sticker, "War is the way Americans learn geography." According to poll data, most Americans had never even heard of Korea before 1950, and I suspect that few could find it on an outline map today. Ditto Vietnam. Not too many years ago, Senator Jesse Helms, then the Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, denounced North Korea's leader, a man he called Kim Jong II. He meant Kim Jong-il. Buck's portrait of rural China proved to have a remarkable influence. In the 1950s, Harold Isaacs, an old China hand, published a pioneering book called Scratches on Our Mind, a survey of American attitudes toward the peoples of Asia, specifically China and India. Isaacs asked a cross-section of Americans where they had acquired their images and ideas about China. He discovered that, quote, "No single book about China has had a greater impact than The Good Earth. It can almost be said," he continued, "that for a whole generation of Americans, Pearl Buck created the Chinese in the same sense that Dickens created Victorian England," end quote. Insofar as it is true, this claim represents a unique achievement. No other text in American literary history has so powerfully shaped the nation's perceptions of another culture. And given today's easy travel and the internet, no text will ever perform that work again. In my opening comments on genre fiction, I suggested that many contemporary bestsellers resemble their predecessors. The cast of characters may change, but the formulas typically remain intact. So to use once again the example of detective fiction, the white tough guy sleuth has been joined by the white tough gal sleuth. And both now share space on the shelf with detectives of both sexes who are African American, Native American, Asian American, gay and lesbian, and immigrant. But they all behave in about the same sleuthy way. There is a good deal of sameness amid the changes. At the same time, I would argue that in the past 20 years or so, the bestseller landscape has indeed been transformed, and quite dramatically. The internet and the big box retailers have played their part, but I want to talk briefly about the writers. Several best-selling authors have become the equivalent of brand names. Those names alone, which invariably appear in larger letters than those of their books, guarantee colossal success. Let me document that statement, starting with a few relevant and often downright startling facts. Item, Danielle Steele. According to her website, America reads Danielle Steele, and so does the rest of the world. Given her publishing record, that claim seems just about correct. Consider that she has published more than 75 novels, at least 30 of which have been included in the top 10 lists since 1983. Perhaps even more remarkably, Steele has on several occasions published 2 novels that made the top 10 in one year, and in 2 consecutive years, 1997 and 1998, Steele placed 3 books on the annual list. Only Stephen King presents a challenge to Danielle Steele in that department. Stephen King. Since the publication of Carrie in 1974, Stephen King has placed approximately 30 different titles on the annual bestseller lists, an average of about 1 every year. On 6 occasions, King published 2 novels that made the top 10 in the same year. In addition, unlike Steele, King's novels have several times been named the #1 bestseller in the annual survey. But King does not own the top spot. That belongs to John Grisham. From 1994 through 2000, an astonishing 7 consecutive years, Grisham's novels placed first on the annual bestseller lists. After settling for both second and third in 2001, Grisham returned to his accustomed #1 spot in 2002 and again in 2005. A novel called The Da Vinci Code intruded in 2003 and 2004. Publishers Weekly did the numbers and declared that Grisham was the best-selling American author of the 1990s, with sales in excess of 60 million copies for that decade. If Grisham had a patent on #1, another brand name, Tom Clancy, has appeared several times right behind him at #2. Beginning with The Hunt for Red October in 1984, Clancy has published a long series of political thrillers and nonfiction books whose sales place him among the 4 or 5 best-selling writers of the past 2 or 3 decades. Clancy also has the distinction of loaning, presumably leasing, his name to other writers who have in their turn published best-selling books in such series as Tom Clancy's Op Center and Tom Clancy's Net Force. Clancy makes the term franchise writer quite literal. To redeploy a metaphor I used at the beginning of the talk, the bestseller list of the past couple of decades have come to resemble a small village inhabited by the members of just a few prominent families who live in very large houses surrounded by small and medium-sized bungalows. Take the 1996 list as both fact and symbol. John Grisham at #1, Tom Clancy at #2, Stephen King at #3, King again at #5 under the name Richard Bachman, Danielle Steele at both #6 and #7. This marketplace concentration is not a completely unprecedented development. Men and women around the English-speaking 19th century world stood in line to buy the latest installment of a Dickens novel. If Margaret Mitchell had ever published a second novel, it would have been an instant bestseller, a retrospective prediction confirmed by the huge success of the execrable pseudo-sequel Scarlet. And something like 15 of James Michener's novels were main selections of the Book of the Month Club. Other examples could be invoked. These ancestral foreshadowings notwithstanding, today's market is dominated as never before by mega writers. This concentration of authorial firepower is connected to the conspicuous increase in the reach of fewer and fewer publishers. According to one source, just 5 publishers are responsible for about 80% of the nation's bestsellers: Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Penguin USA, and Simon & Schuster. These are the companies that possess the marketing know-how, the advertising budgets, and the global reach that now drive and define the book business. One final proposal about the difference between today's bestsellers and at least some of those that preceded them. The more recent books seem to be less methodically connected to significant social issues than their popular predecessors. In particular, the link between recent popular literature and social protest seems less strong. To overstate, which I fully acknowledge, but I hope not too badly, a survey of the main names might suggest that the most popular contemporary writers have abandoned large sectors of the public sphere. Where is the fictional equivalent of Uncle Tom's Cabin with its cry of outrage against slavery, or of The Jungle, which exposed the barbarism of the meatpacking industry, or Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, in which he dramatized the suffering of battered Dust Bowl refugees? If my speculation is correct, if most best-selling writers have typically drifted away from direct engagement with major public issues, the explanation may lie as much in the changing nature of our society and its media as with the writers. To put it simply, books no longer occupy as much cultural space as they once did. When Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her novel attacking slavery, whatever national conversation American citizens had was confined to print, books, magazines, pamphlets, and newspapers. Magazines were more plentiful and were illustrated when Upton Sinclair exposed the brutality of Chicago's slaughterhouses, but electronic media had not yet appeared. Steinbeck's sympathetic account of his luckless farmers was competing with the radio and the movie house newsreel, but not with the television and the internet. Today's reformers typically choose nonfiction as their literary form, or choose other media such as the documentary film or even the viral YouTube film clip. For better or worse, more than one critic has compared Michael Moore to Upton Sinclair and John Steinbeck. Those are a few of the changes that have marked the best-selling book trade over the past couple of decades. What changes will the next 20 years bring? I haven't the slightest idea. Thank you. It's our custom to allow a minute or two for people that have to leave without any embarrassment or self-consciousness. So if you have to go, go. And then after we settle down again, we can have a question and answer section. And we can put the lights back on, I think. Okay. Let's see here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there's a microphone which goes around.
Regarding bestsellers, I guess it seems like there's another category. Maybe you consider. I mean, it is nonfiction, but self-help books are the other. Diet books.
Yeah.
Relationship books.
Yeah.
Has that been true since the 19th century as well?
In the teaching company bestseller lectures that I did, which is a way for me to plug a commercial product on which I make money, I did include some of those nonfiction examples. And I mean, the short answer is there a short answer? I mean, in some respects, take what may have been the best-selling nonfiction book of the American 20th century, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. When you talk about that book, read the book, and look back on its antecedents, some scholars trace it back as far as Benjamin Franklin, his autobiography, and his various aphorisms and so on, in which, among other things, he tells us almost exactly what Carnegie tells us about how to get along with people, how to make sure you always credit the other guy with the good idea. Carnegie, by the way, whom I hadn't read until I worked on it, is not wacky. I mean, there's a reason why that book is probably the best-selling nonfiction. He says at one point, smile even when you're not really feeling like smiling, because it'll go a long way. And then in another wonderful sentence, he says, when you're trying to land a customer, use his name. No word is sweeter to a man's ears than his own name. So yes, I shouldn't say all of them, but at least the couple that I have spent time looking at do have pedigrees that go back and come forward. As far as the self-help in a certain sense, I could trace back as well to the Horatio Alger stories and Ragged Dick, right? Through a combination of luck and pluck, you pull yourselves up from the raggedy orphanhood of your childhood into at least a measure of respectability. There's something in the American grain about a lot of these things, and I suspect that we could probably trace most of them back quite a ways.
Is the state of bestsellers in England different than it is in the United States?
I mean, there are different writers who become bestsellers, although in the case of the two best-selling writers in America of the 20th century, neither of whom I mentioned tonight, because I guess I did mention one, both are British. Agatha Christie has sold more books in the United States than any other writer in the English language, followed by J.K. Rowling. So we do share occasionally some best-selling writers, but the dynamics of the market, according to a book by a man named John Sutherland, who is a British scholar who writes on bestsellers, the way he describes what goes on there in terms of advertising and franchise names and so on is not too different from what goes on here.
I wanted to ask about a different nonfiction genre, which is documentary. This was open to what you're saying is that maybe didn't have a social role that was played by the jungle at a certain point now being taken over by people like Michael Moore through documentary. But I wondered, can you think of examples of fairly popular sort of fictional treatments of socially, sort of who is the John Steinbeck of today, or is that kind of migrated? Because these are quasi-documentary examples from the early 20th century, and is fiction still the way that people are approaching it?
That was sort of the point I was making, and I acknowledge that I stand ready to be corrected, but the argument I was making was precisely that documentarian impulse, which used to find an outlet fairly routinely in at least some best-selling books. And I don't want to exaggerate that. The vast majority of best-selling books are forgotten completely, are worthy of having been forgotten completely, and are mostly of the status of beside the bonny briar bush. I mean, they don't really bear much recovery. But my argument was that documentary impulse, now there's more places to go. I mean, in a way, Steinbeck started the Grapes of Wrath saying, this is going to be journalism. I'm not going to write a novel. I'm going to write hard-hitting journalism. And it became something, I think people would argue, far more powerful in the end, far more influential, at least in the end, far more visible, far more probably enduring. It bounces up and down, as you know, in the American literary canon. That's a book which almost crosses over every once in a while into these are books you should read. And then it sort of slips off the table again, and then it comes back again, and so on. Yeah.
I don't know whether you follow it, but maybe you have a comment on young adult fiction and...
I don't have a comment on young adult fiction, Torch, because I haven't read much. I got interviewed not too long ago about bestsellers, and when the guy called, he said, I'm going to ask you about the Twilight series. So I ran out and read one. And it was the first and only, I guess it's called, young adult contemporary bestseller that I read. So I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I have some hypotheses that I think I just pick up from the journalism. For example, that they've probably over the last 30 or 40 years become tougher and more shocking and more candid and a lot of other things that some people will decry and some people will applaud. But beyond that, I don't know much about it.
Can you tell us about what you did with Oprah's book club?
Yeah, well, isn't that kind of you? So I mentioned that her book, Pearl Buck's book, became the selection in the fall of '04. And you can still find all this on the archive and the website. It's a heck of a website. And I was in the provost's office at the time, which meant that other people answered my phone. And somebody came in and said, Oprah's on the phone. And I said, no, she's not. And I went back to work. And the sheepish person came back in and said, well, it's not Oprah, but it's somebody that works for Oprah. And I said, I don't think so. So nonetheless, how can you not? So I picked up the phone and I said, what's up? And she said, I'll tell you what's up after you sign the non-disclosure and confidentiality agreement that I'm about to fax to you and fax it back to me. And I thought about that, and then I thought, what I'm supposed to do at a moment like that, in a job like that, is call Wendy White, the general counsel of the university, and say, should I do that? But I knew Wendy would say no. So I wanted to do it, so I did it. And then the woman called back, and she did apologize, and she said, look, here's the deal. The reason for all this mummery, pokery, is Oprah's picked the good earth, but she wants to announce it in 2 weeks, and she never likes to be scooped. In fact, one learns that there's a lot of things Oprah doesn't like, and being scooped is one of them. So, in any case, so my job turned out to be purely via internet and email, which is to say, the book club members are invited. Well, first I had to write biographical and historical background and so on for the site. But then book club members, I'd never seen the book club before, are invited to submit questions. Then a staff in Chicago culled the thousands of questions that came in a given week and sent me 10. And my job was to answer 5. And then they would put those 5 questions and answers up week after week throughout the semester. And they said, well, let's talk compensation. And I said, let's do that. I want to be on the show. And they said, let's talk about something else, like money, because you're not getting on the show. So I not only never spoke to or met Oprah, I probably never got within 3 concentric circles of her innermost entourage. But nonetheless, it was fun. It was fun.
Just speak a little bit about the American assassination with Paul McLean, the book.
Oh, goodness, yes. A friend of mine, Molly Haskell, who's a very good critic, has just written a whole book on Gone with the Wind, the movie in particular, which has, of course, had even more impact on American culture than the book, presumably. Here's the thing. Let me do this really briefly, because otherwise I would risk going on and on. When the book came out and began almost instantly to identify itself as what was going to prove to be the best-selling American novel in history. I mean, that happened almost overnight. And it retained that status, I suspect, probably until things like the Da Vinci Code later on. When that book first came out and began to make this huge splash, Margaret Mitchell wrote to a friend and said, I don't know what's going on. This is a fairly simple yarn. It doesn't have anything in it that ought to attract this kind of attention. What's happening? And, at a whole set of levels, she wasn't being modest, she was being right. I mean, there had been hundreds of Civil War novels. There have been thousands of, bodice-ripping romance novels between the bad boy and the sexually independent woman. So what was it? Now, nobody knows at the end of the day why something like that takes off. But the closest I can come to a hypothesis is this. First of all, and in this I'm critical of that novel, in many respects its attitudes, for example, about race, are so retrograde and are surrounded with such a sentimental aura of attractiveness that it tended to reinforce and, alas, I think, to reaffirm certain stereotypical views about race, about American history, about how Reconstruction was a disaster, and so on. And I think in the Depression, which the book spoke to, I mean, in a way, it's a Depression novel in certain respects, right? People against the land, their farms destroyed, I'll never be hungry again, as God is my witness, I'll make it back. I think there was some encouragement in that, but I think there was also this encouragement about the past was a better place, and here are some of the things to know about the past. But at the end of the day, what I decided, it was Scarlett. With all of her faults, with all of her meanness and cruelty and voraciousness and racism, Scarlett is an almost irresistible heroine. And I think she imprinted herself fairly rapidly on the American imagination. But I don't have, this is the answer to that question. I don't know.
I thought your comment towards the end about how things have changed. You no longer write a sort of novel that Uncle Tom's Cabin or John represents. It's very interesting. And I want to ask you to elaborate more on the changes. In particular, isn't it influence your academia? I know you're not happy with academics.
How did you know that? Pardon?
Which may well make a difference on how literature is being received.
Yeah, that's a very useful observation, which I probably can't do much with at the moment. But when I talked about transformations in the surrounding media and communications culture, right? Now we have the internet, now we have the YouTube, now we have this, that, and the other thing, beyond TV and so forth, and films. What I also probably should have included, and at least given some thought to, is the professionalization of literary study itself, and the extent to which that may contribute to one, in one way or another, to the way in which all of us, but certainly readers in large numbers, may be responding to certain kinds of literature. There was a period when I could have given you a more straightforward answer, but I think that period came and went, and that is during the immediate post-war years, in the 50s and into the 60s, when, to caricature them and to simplify them, a lot of literary academics were busy constructing an aesthetically configured canon. Then, at that point, it was very easy to dismiss novels that seemed to have political programs as being subliterary. That's less true today. And so it isn't clear to me that that explanation would hold all the way through the 20th century. But it's a very good question that I should give more thought to. I just hadn't thought about it.
I was curious about the observation, very interesting observation that you made, that bestsellers from the 19th century and early 20th century that dealt with social matters were fiction, and it seems like there's been a change towards nonfiction. I was wondering why you think in the 19th century and the early 20th century those socially charged.
I think I've done my best to try and respond to that 2 or 3 times already. That is, I've talked about the changes in the surrounding media culture. I think that's part of it. I've now been encouraged to think a little bit about the changes in the institutional sort of literary culture. I think that's part of it. I can't go much beyond that. And I also want to acknowledge that it's a hypothesis that may not stand up if somebody knows a lot more about some of the stuff than I do, as well as acknowledging that by and large, most bestsellers are escapist trash. I mean, that's why I like them. That's why people who read them like them. That's what you're looking for. So, I mean, for every jungle, there are, 97 Agatha Christie novels, and for every Good Earth even, which had a cultural impact, there are lots and lots of Miss Marple novels. So I can't go beyond having said what I said.
But was it the nonfiction genre just wasn't so?
I'm sorry?
Was it the nonfiction genre just wasn't so?
Oh, well, that's okay. I see what you're saying. Nonfiction as a cultural phenomenon has played, obviously, an important role in the culture alongside fiction. For example, when I said that the Uncle Tom's Cabin was probably the first American book to sell over 1 million copies, a book, 47-page pamphlet, nonfiction, half a century earlier, may or may not have sold 1 million copies, but it was probably read or read out loud by almost every adult male in the United States, and that was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January of 1776 and making a provable contribution to the debate over American independence, sold in the at least hundreds of thousands, and was read to pieces by people in taverns and read out loud and on city corners and so on. It was probably the widest circulating piece of prose in the history of America, based on the population, as a proportion of the population. So no, forgive me, you were asking a different, I didn't mean to suggest there isn't a lot of nonfiction flowering in that earlier period, but it's flowering alongside a certain kind of fiction that I see less of, that's all. Thank you. Sir.
When you think of best-selling novels in the past few centuries, are there any that you think could be categorized as great literature, not considering their historical or social relevance, but simply as
even if they weren't. Well, I said that a very few novels. I'm not so much reporting my own opinion here, although I could go on and do that. But let's just say the consensus of opinion would be that a handful of books have sort of shown up on both lists. I'll give you what may be the most, certainly one of the most prominent of them. Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth was the best-selling American novel of 1905, and it made her rich overnight. I mean, she already was fairly rich. It made her richer overnight. And that's a book which, although it sometimes has struggled to maintain its place in the so-called reading list, I think is pretty securely there. I mentioned Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which was the best-selling American novel of 1940. It also gains some purchase, at least from time to time. I'll give you a couple of others. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is an undeniably important book, while it wasn't the best-selling novel of its year, was on the list at the end of 1950 or 51. Depending on what you think of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, Catcher was a bestseller and continues to sell. I had thought, in fact, that Catcher had come and gone finally, and I have a lecture class of undergraduates, and when Salinger died, I went in the next day and asked the class how many of these 50 or so undergraduates had read it. Almost every single hand went up. So I was a little bit, that doesn't mean they all loved it or whatever, and went out and became Holden Caulfield, but they had all still read it. So there are a number of such books.
What do you think about the trashiness of the trash novels, and whether there's been some recycling of that trash, so to speak, in the sense that in a world of media and images, television and video games and so forth, reading a book, however trashy, might seem now, in that light, to be more active, more educational, exercise literacy, and what people reading books. And so there's been some sense in which the so-called trashy novels have more status.
Okay, maybe I never know whether it depends on the day of the week, whether to join in the general lament for the end of the book and the death of print and the death of reading and so on, or to figure that reading will go on and print will go on and books will go on. Certainly, I think a lot of, for example, I do spend some time, as Wendy was kind enough to mention, with teachers in Philadelphia public schools, and they are looking for what Torch referred to, young adult literature, and looking for, frankly, some stuff that I wouldn't necessarily assign to, let's say, my freshmen at Penn. But they're books that are considered to be readable by some of the students, and it gets them reading. And that, after all, is at least at some level job number one, is to get people reading. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering, I don't know whether you thought about this at all, but you talked about how right now there's kind of the 5 big publishing houses.
Yeah.
That are
It's probably, I got that information 2 years ago, it's probably 4 now.
No,
There are 5, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what's happening in the book business is similar to has happened in the music business, where now there's a lot of self-publishing going on, and printing is starting to have competition with ebooks and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how that might impact what happens with bestsellers and how people read over there.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously is the $64 question, because that's not one that's purely speculative. We already now have, a decade or so of experience, and people can see which way it's going. I'm not going to speculate on it, except to say again that I'll give you one anecdote, which is at least partly relevant. I hope it's relevant. So some years ago, Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press made a deal with Penn and, I don't know, half a dozen other university libraries. And the deal went something like this. I may misspeak a little bit, but I'll get it approximately right. They would mount on our library site the full text of all their new books in American history behind the password. So it wouldn't be open to the public, but open to anybody with a Penn password. Illustrations, maps, indexes, and of course clickable links were already just beginning to emerge, hyperlinks. And the idea was an experiment to see what happened to the print versions of those books. Now, in retrospect, it may be perfectly obvious and intuitive, but it seemed counterintuitive to us at the time. The sales of the print versions went up because people would get on the site and say, this is terrific. I otherwise might not have looked at it, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and read 350 pages of a history book online. And so they go out and buy the book. Now, I don't know if that's held true, but there is a certain logic to it. And I must say, I now treat online versions of many texts as an alternative, not as an alternative, but as a separate, in other words, those hyperlinks are tremendous, and being able to navigate around through journal articles and so on at the click of a button is tremendous. But I still want to read a book when I'm reading and take my own notes and so on. So, yeah, I mean, one could be encouraged by some of this stuff. Some of this, it's actually, it's democratizing, it's distributing this stuff in so many other ways. It's a question of who's going to own it eventually and keep the rest of us from getting anywhere near it. And anybody in this room who's ever tried to get permission to reproduce a photograph or a work of art, has a foretaste of what this could all turn out to be like. And believe me, it's not pretty. Let's have one more. Sir.
Huckleberry Finn, and I guess we should say Tom Sawyer. What are the stats, historical stats, as to the readership of those books, and are they still being read?
Yeah. Huckleberry Finn was, in fact, a bestseller. But by that I mean I corresponded with a guy at the University of Virginia who is one of the world's leading authorities on Huck Finn, and I said, I think I want to write about Huck Finn as one of these, because I know it sold a lot for its generation, for its moment. And he wrote back and said, yes, it sold at least 70,000 copies in its first year, and by mid-1880 standards, that made it a very strong seller. I think it's still, by a very large proportion of both teachers in schools and faculty in universities and by critics who write professionally for newspapers and magazines, still regarded to some extent as one of the key texts in American literature. You recall Hemingway's famous remark, all of American literature begins with a book by a man named Huckleberry Finn by a man named Mark Twain. There's been a lot of dissent because of its racial epithet. There's been a lot of dissent over the treatment of Jim. There's been a lot of dissent, by the way, on purely formal grounds because the last third of the novel is a mess. Just, on anybody's calculation. But I suspect the book is still out there. One of the reasons that some books, by the way, hang on, again, if you talk to high school teachers in many districts, teacher once told me, I said, why are you teaching this? And she said, I teach the book closet, which is to say they don't have the money very often to get books that are current, and so they teach what they've got 30 or 40 or 50 or 80 copies of, and Huckleberry Finn may often be one of those books. So it's not a tremendously sophisticated dialogue over the relevant value or racial attitudes of that book. It's available. So, all right, thank you.